Well, hi, my name is Donna Lynn Thomas, and I am the author of Teeny Tiny Quilts from C&T Publications. I have always been fascinated by small things. Even as a child, I liked to play with small toys. When I started making quilting back in the 70s, it became a personal challenge to see how small I could go with the quilts that I was making. But back then, we were using templates, and they kind of limited how small you could go because the templates would become too big, your fingers were in the way. And then rotary cutting entered the world of quilting, and I could do all kinds of things that I couldn't do before. So in Teeny Tiny Quilts, I share my love of making miniature quilts with you. Don't let the title fool you, because there are multiple sizes of quilts to each of the 12 patterns. In fact, there are 35 samples in the book. You get to choose your degree of how small you want to go. And let me explain how this works. So in the book, there are 3 different classifications of quilts. There are the small quilts, the smaller quilts, and the smallest quilts. And generally speaking, the small quilts have blocks that run anywhere from 4 to 6 inches in size. The smaller quilts are the medium sized, and they run anywhere from 3 to 4 inches in finished size. And then the smallest ones, which are my passion, can run anywhere from 1.5 up to 3 inches in size. So with all of these, each pattern has multiple sizes associated with it, so you can choose which size quilt you want to start with, so you don't feel pressured to start with just the little ones. You can start with a large one and work your way down, or if you're like me and you just want to dive right into the minis, you can do that as well. But you get to choose which degree of small you would like to try. Now with 35 samples, we have fabrics that are traditional to contemporary to Kay Fawcett, to everything in between. So there's a sample, there's something that appeals to everybody, and I hope you'll take a look at them and see if there's a quilt that just calls to you and makes your heart sing. So you might ask, is there some super secret trick that I have to make these little miniature quilts come together? Well, actually the answer is no, especially for the small and smaller size quilts. Now when you get to the miniature, the tiny smallest ones, there are a few extra things that we do just to make it work a little bit better, and those are covered in the book. But in general, it's all dependent on accurate cutting, accurate sewing, and accurate pressing, just like with our big quilts. Pieced quilts are like a puzzle. If you haven't cut accurately, sewn accurately, pressed accurately, your finished sizes might not be what they're supposed to be, and your pieces won't fit together. So what we're going to do is take a look at your seam allowance as the first important thing for you to be able to master, and that's a good 1/4 inch seam allowance that we quilters like to use. We're going to start with a test. Let's take a test, and we're going to use this test to help you assess the accuracy of your seam guide and your ability to use it well. So let's get on with the test. So to take the strip test, we're going to take 3 strips that are each cut 1.5 inches wide. The length of the strip isn't really important. I cut them at 3 inches, but you can cut them whatever length you want. We're going to sew them together side by side, and the end result should be exactly 1 inch center width of this strip in the middle here. And we're not going to measure this way. We're not going to measure this way. What we want is a 1-inch ruler to sit right in there between the 2 ridges formed by the seams here. And if it fits in without you having to stretch to make it fit and it doesn't wobble, then you have a perfect strip test and you are ready to start sewing. So how we do this is we take 3 strips, pick up the first set to sew, and we're going to align our edges perfectly. When we sew, we're going to use the edge of our guide perfectly. Hear that word, perfect? And we're going to sew slowly. When you sew slowly, you have more control. The faster you go, the less control you have over the pieces that you're sewing, and they can actually destabilize and move out of alignment. So once we have this one sewn, we're going to press the seams away from the center strip, and we'll sew this 3rd strip into place, and that's when we do our measurements to see what our strip width is on this center strip. Now, if it's fine, you're ready to go. If not, don't be discouraged, because that is very, very normal. I see this all the time in classes, and there are many ways that we can assess what's going wrong and solve the problems. So the first thing to deal with is to make sure that you've cut your strips accurately. So go back and measure. Sometimes it's just a simple matter of the strip width isn't what it's supposed to be, and therefore your finished product isn't going to be either. So check your cutting first. The next thing you want to check is the presser foot that you're using. If you're using a 1/4 inch foot, you want to make sure that you're lining your fabric up accurately. When you sew, you want your foot to be along the edge of your fabric, to be under your foot, but not sticking out past it, nor so far under that it's not measuring accurately on the edge of the guide. So that's one of the things to check as well. Sometimes you might have a 1/4 inch foot that has this little metal guide on the side, and you have to be careful with these. Some of them are wonderful, some of them have some issues, and you want to make sure that this guide is flush up against the edge of the foot, because the edge of the foot is your guide. If there's a gap here, then your fabric is going to be pushing against the guide, and it's going to make your seam allowance too big. Sometimes some of these feet will wobble, and it's a simple matter of having them tightened up, but you want to make sure that it's stable and it's flush against the edge of your foot. If that's not the case, then you might want to switch to another foot, such as your standard foot, and use one of the other sewing guides that I pointed out just a minute ago in place of a foot as your sewing guide for your 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you don't have a good 1/4 inch presser foot for your sewing machine, there are guides out there that can help take care of that problem. This one mounts on the sewing bed of your sewing machine, and these are used in conjunction with graph paper to create a ridge that you will then run your pieces along when you sew. And the nice thing about both of these is they give you the marking as you're heading under the presser foot, because really once your fabric is under the presser foot, it's really too late to make any shifts. So this aligns your fabric so that it enters the presser foot, it goes underneath the presser foot in perfect position. There are many products like this out there. These are two of my favorites. So consider investing in sewing guides if you're having trouble with a presser foot, finding a presser foot that works for your machine. Okay, we've talked about some of the problems that can occur with the machine itself or your sewing guide. Unfortunately, there are also sometimes some operator problems, and the first one that I see most often in class is if you go back and measure your strip width, sometimes the strips you didn't cut them the right size, they're off by just a little bit, but that can make a difference in the end result of your strip test. So the first thing to do is always go back and check your the width of your strips to make sure you cut them the right width. The next problem that I see most frequently is that the edges were not actually aligned evenly when you started sewing. So your 1/4 inch guide might be right for one piece, the seam might be right for one piece, but it isn't for the other, and that will result in an inaccurate strip width in the end. The other thing I see is inconsistent sewing, where you're not keeping the edge lined up consistently with the guide as you're sewing, and it'll give you a little wobble. This is exaggerated, but that gives you the idea. And these two samples are an example of the same problem with the machine. Some machines have trouble starting out in the correct position. And so in this one, it's starting too small, and then you get back into line, and then when you get to the end, it kind of pulls away. And this is the same, reverse of the same problem, where it starts wide, and you can get back into position, and then widens out at the end. One of the things that I would recommend doing, if this is the case, is to start with scrap leads. I always sew with scrap leads anyway, but start with some fabric that you sew across before you run your pieces in. And lots of times, once the feed dogs and presser feet have fabric engaged in the back, what's coming in the front will come in more smoothly. So once you've gotten your seam allowance mastered, you will have happy days with your sewing. Your sewing machine will be happy, you'll be happy, and the world will just be full of sunshine and roses because you have got that seam allowance mastered. Best gift you can give yourself is to get a good 1/4 inch seam going.